to start, Nawal, were people principally happy to be filmed so that knowledge about their misery will be known in Western countries?
I've been reporting on the war since it began for the last 3 years, so I made multiple trips to Yemen, and it's been really interesting to see actually how people have become more open to speaking to the media, mainly because they're so desperate, because they feel like they're being ignored, because they've reached a stage where they really want to get their story out there, hoping that the world will wake up and do something about what's going on in Yemen. It's the poorest country in the Middle East way before this war began, but we never saw these horrifying pictures of starvation. And that was mainly because people rely on each other and they rely on their neighbors. But I think within the next year, we'll see the situation get a whole lot worse very quickly, because it's only been 1 year of people not having salaries. But then very soon people will lose that support network and they'll fall into that bracket of severe malnutrition.
So the first thing I just wanted to touch upon is one of the main reasons that have led us to this point is the conduct of hostilities, right? So this is why we're here, this is why we're talking about this. So Yemen has been at war, and I'm saying at war generally, since March 2015, that's well known. The conduct of hostilities has been characterized by widespread violations by everybody, and we're talking just complete impunity, no one holding them accountable, because there's no central government, there's no rules and orders, these institutions have fallen apart, and now we're 2.5 years into the conflict and it's still the same situation. So what does that actually mean on the ground? It means that since they're all fighting each other, whether it's aerial bombardment or ground attacks, certain amount of civilians have been killed or injured. So up to 14,000, according to the UN, have been killed and injured up to this point. Up to 2 million have been displaced.
I think we've seen over the last couple of years, especially in Saudi Arabia, the articulation of what you could call religious nationalism on a very vocal, overt basis by the new rulers of the state. There is the projection of themselves as defending the Sunnis of the Middle East against their Shia rivals. That said, I think everybody in Saudi Arabia, including at the very top of the pile, recognise how badly the war has gone in Yemen. They weren't expecting a 3-year aerial bombing campaign. So the problematic nature of this is not just perceived from the humanitarian standpoint or the human rights standpoint. It's also a process which I think the Saudi government has seen the need to back out of. But it can't do so without, in that sense, losing face, losing the credibility of political leaders. But that's where we are. That's why we've been in this conflict for 3 years, and why there is so limited a prospect of its culmination.
I think for the moment, perhaps, we should leave it and open the discussion to the floor.
So what do you sense the Yemeni population on the ground are thinking in terms of their support for either the Houthis in the north or the legitimate government or the internationally recognised government, given the crisis with salaries, given the horrific circumstances that they're going through?
One of the main reasons that the Houthis garnered so much support in the beginning is because of the litany of mistakes that President Hadi made during his time in power, and also because they came at a time where the subsidies were lifted off of fuel, and so that's why people supported the Houthis, not because they believed in their ideological beliefs or they believed in the Houthis. It was just because they were fighting for something that affected everyone on the ground. Over the course of the war, I think the more the airstrikes were heavy on the north of Yemen, the more people supported the Houthis, because they felt like they were the only force on the ground that were fighting against the strikes that were coming down from the air. Just like we saw across the Arab world following the Arab Spring, after a lot of conflict following the Arab Spring, people started to want the previous dictatorships to come back, because they associated them with safety and stability and security, and that's what happened in Yemen. And so now what you see is a lot of people that went out on the streets in 2011 against Ali Abdullah Saleh are now wishing that he will come back. And this is actually happening across the country, shockingly. And they say, we know he's corrupt, we know he's terrible, but at least there was no fighting and we had our salaries.
So perhaps if you could mention about Iran. Do they see Iran as a threat?
With regard to Iran, so my own sense is that this has been over-talked as an issue in respect to the Houthis, that the Iranian government gives rhetorical support. It makes limited attempts to give weapons to them, but it's actually relatively disengaged from its support for the Houthi movement, and always has been. I mean, the Houthi movement, Ansarallah, began as a rebellion without any external support in 2004. One shouldn't see them as a proxy movement for the Iranians. One shouldn't see them as being just a tool in a strategic game that's played out across the Gulf region.